Have you ever wondered why some minds just seem to operate on a completely different frequency from the rest of the world's? Well, today we're embarking on a fascinating scientific journey into the actual architecture of the human mind. We're going to peel back the layers of how we process reward, how we form our identity, and how we navigate an incredibly noisy world. So why exactly do some minds completely reject mass entertainment? I mean, think about it. Have you ever sat in a living room full of people literally screaming at a TV screen over a football game and you felt absolutely nothing? Maybe you were just sitting there wondering how long you had to pretend to care about a fantasy rocket. Now, if that sounds like you've probably been told at some point that you lack passion. But what if lacking an interest in mass cultural phenomena, like sports fandom, isn't a personal flaw at all? What if it's actually a marker of a highly distinct, deeply analytical psychological framework? To really unpack this, we're going to organize this explainer into 5 key areas: society's expectation of fandom, dopamine and internal rewards, mastering the mental pause, seeking depth over spectacle, and finally, the cost of independence. Let's dive in. Part 1. Society's expectation of fandom, what we'll call the myth of apathy. You see, there's this pervasive societal myth that if you don't obsess over sports or mass trends, you must just be boring, antisocial, or completely emotionless. We're essentially trained to view crowd excitement as the baseline for normal human joy. But psychology actually tells a much more interesting story. This disconnect is explained by something called social identity theory. This is basically the framework where people derive their sense of self, their pride, and their belonging from group loyalty, like fiercely defending a local sports team. But folks who don't follow sports, they just rely a lot less on this group-based identity. They aren't broken. They just find their sense of self and personal values and internal goals. They literally don't need to put on a team jersey to know exactly who they are. And here is the absolutely crucial point. It really comes down to emotional efficiency. Independent minds naturally value predictability and agency. Subconsciously, they realize that pouring massive amounts of emotional energy into a game where they have absolutely zero control over the outcome, well, it's just an inefficient use of their mental resources. It's not apathy at all. It is a highly logical, efficient rejection of investing in uncontrollable outcomes. Which brings us to part 2, dopamine and internal rewards, rewiring fulfillment. So if the independent brain isn't getting its dopamine kick from a roaring stadium crowd, where exactly is it getting it? Well, mass spectacle relies heavily on external triggers, right? The anticipation, the bitter rivalry, those quick, massive emotional spikes. But independent minds are wired differently. They're driven by internal triggers. They crave mastery. They crave intense curiosity and deep focus. They're looking for long-term satisfaction rather than a fleeting external rush of excitement. In fact, highly intelligent brains process reality so rapidly that standard, repetitive routines can actually feel physically uncomfortable, like mentally painful. They disengage quickly because their motivation relies so heavily on novelty and complexity. If the entertainment is too simple or just too predictable, the brain gets bored almost instantly. I mean, think about how agonizing it is to listen to the same recycled small talk at every office party, or to nod along while someone breaks down a referee's call for the 5th time. Your brain is just begging for something more complex. All right, moving to part 3, mastering the mental pause, the architecture of control. This brings us to a really fascinating psychological trait known as cognitive inhibition. This is your executive ability to literally hit the brakes on an automatic emotional reaction. It creates a mental gap between what you feel and what you do. High IQ individuals use this advanced executive control to stay completely composed under pressure. So instead of reacting instinctively, they regulate. You can really see the stark difference in brain wiring here. The standard evolutionary response is to react first, right? To panic under pressure, or immediately rush to defend your ego when you're insulted. But the highly intelligent, controlled response is the exact opposite. They use their working memory to intentionally create that mental gap, evaluate the consequences of their actions, and only then do they respond. It all happens in this quiet, almost instantaneous mental sequence. You pause, you observe, and then you respond deliberately. And you know what's funny? Society often mistakes this incredible restraint for coldness, or emotional distance, or even weakness, when in reality, it's a marker of profound cognitive strength. It requires immense mental energy to override our primitive instincts and actively choose calm over chaos. Let's shift our focus to part 4, seeking depth over spectacle, and the weight of awareness. If you've been nodding along with us so far, this concept is probably going to feel pretty validating. You possess what's known as a higher tolerance for social misalignment. Basically, this means you feel perfectly comfortable being out of sync with the crowd. Refusing to fake excitement over a mass event just to fit in, that isn't you being difficult or snobby. It's actually a sign of incredibly strong internal validation. You simply do not need the crowd's approval to feel secure in your own interests. But look, we have to be honest. There are very real, frankly alienating side effects that come with this kind of cognitive depth. Because your mind rarely slows down, it constantly replays and questions information, which can lead to some heavy mental exhaustion. You naturally seek deep mental resonance, which makes shallow small talk feel incredibly isolating. You also automatically question rules, traditions, and authority, and we all know that can cause some serious friction in rigid environments like a traditional workplace. Plus, you might find yourself intellectualizing your feelings a lot, using logic to distance yourself from emotional overwhelm, rather than just letting yourself actually feel the pain. Which leads us right into our final section, Part 5, the cost of independence, and navigating that burden. When your brain is wired to process reality a bit more fully than the people around you, you inevitably pick up on hidden burdens. You naturally anticipate long-term global and personal risks that others just completely miss. And that can lead to a quiet, kind of existential anxiety. And because you can so clearly imagine ideal outcomes in your head, you might struggle with some pretty debilitating perfectionism and relentless self-criticism. On top of that, standard linear life paths often feel meaningless to you. So you likely experience a quiet identity conflict when you're forced to navigate conventional life milestones that society says you should be hitting. This fiercely analytical approach even spills over into how you handle getting help. Think about it. While most people look for emotional acceptance and reassurance when they ask for advice, highly intelligent minds automatically shift into analytical evaluation mode. You don't just blindly accept advice, do you? You test its logic. You demand evidence. You prioritize internal reasoning over external comfort. And sometimes, that can actually make the people trying to help you feel a bit unheard, even when you deeply, truly respect them. All of this leaves us with one really powerful thought to close out this explainer. Real intelligence isn't loud, it's controlled. Your independence, your lack of interest in the roaring crowd, it's not a flaw. It is the beautiful, heavy cost of having a deeply capable mind. So the next time you find yourself feeling a little out of place in a sea of screaming fans, I want you to ask yourself a question. Are you actually missing out, or is your mind simply built for something far deeper?